Last week with a discussion in the top half of page 2 with reference to the weaker and the stronger brother. And from the outset, noting that the identity of the weaker or stronger brother is not relevant. In some of these cases, in Romans 14, the weaker brethren could be Jews that are weak in regard to non-kosher foods. Or it could be Gentiles who are weak in their knowledge concerning idols and meat offered to idols. And by the way, the church at Corinth and the church at Rome are very similar in the fact that they were both made up of sizable Jewish and Gentile populations. And this exact same thing, if you wanted to read a parallel account of this, Paul wrote to this in Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And he summarized what he's going to discuss in Romans 14 in this line. He says, "If eating meat causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again." And that summarized his attitude in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 as an instructive measure to the church at Corinth. And that's essentially what he's teaching here in Romans 14. He said in 1 Corinthians 8, he says, we all know that an idol is nothing in this world. It's just an object. There's nothing to it. As Isaiah said, it can't see, it can't hear, it can't walk. It's nothing. And so a thing offered to nothing in and of itself is also nothing. But it couldn't be something by way of conscience. And so that's, 1 Corinthians 8 is a beautiful parallel to Romans 14. And I would suggest you read 1 Corinthians 8. Then we noted that not only is the identity of the weaker or stronger brother discussed, we closed last week talking about how those that think they're the stronger brother might actually be the weaker brother. And I gave you the express example of me and Bill and Toby in Ghana, discussing the matter of and this was kind of a new thing that, hadn't been going on a long time so far as most of us were concerned. Bringing coffee and donuts to the Sunday school class and having a table, coffee and donuts, and everybody come in, get coffee and donuts and sit down for Bible class. And Toby made the statement, he said, he always called us boys. Now Toby's only 12 years older than me and Bill, all right? But he always called us boys. Boys? He said, boys? He says, I can't help but think that we might be the weaker brethren in this matter. And Bill and I we just got offended. I mean, not like literally offended at Toby, but it just never occurred to me and Bill that we might be the weaker brethren in this thing. Because we're the stronger brethren, because we're preachers. We know and this and that. And then Billy and I discussed that very conversation over a week, less than 2 weeks ago, before last Wednesday night. He remembered it just as vividly as I did, because we were discussing Romans 14, and that conversation came up, and Bill and I both realized we'd already come to the realization. We just never talked about the conversation again. We both came to the realization and discussed the fact that in that particular instance, we both thought we were the stronger brothers, the stronger brethren, when in fact we were the weaker brethren. In other words, we were ready to condemn that which the Bible did not condemn. The Bible doesn't say anything about coffee and donuts in Bible class. In fact, the Bible doesn't even say anything about Bible class. And so, Bill and I had taken the position, eat at home, which is still my position, by the way. Eat at home. All right? But we weren't at liberty to bind on others what God had not bound. And so it took us 20 years to realize when we thought we were the stronger brethren, we were actually the weaker brethren in that matter. And so I wanted to make the point that that there are a lot of things wherein we think we're the stronger brethren, but it might be because we're only defending a traditional position rather than upholding a matter of liberty. And that's what really makes a stronger brother in the text, is not his position on doctrine, but his position on liberty. Because doctrine is doctrine, and conscience and liberty are conscience and liberty, and those two things are not the same. And so we want to be mindful. We want to be mindful of the fact that our position on doctrine should be unanimity. We should be unified in doctrine. But in matters of liberty, the stronger brother is the one who not only recognizes liberty, but is willing to forego liberty. All right? And then I think it would also be fair to say, and I think I did mention this at the end of the class, that you can be a weaker brother in a matter and yet still be strong because you recognize liberty that others have, but you recognize that you yourself, it's like my conscience won't allow me to do a thing, but I recognize that other people's conscience will allow it, and I allow them that liberty. So I'm the weaker brother in what's going on, but I can also be strong in the sense that I recognize their liberty, and I don't create a problem over their liberty. So there's a couple of different ways kind of to be strong in a matter. And so now we go to verse 3. There's some really interesting words, and you know I love words. I love words. I know you say, I know you do, you use enough of them. But verse 3 in chapter 14. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Received him. Now note the distinction between the warning given to the strong Christian and the warning given to the weaker Christian. You see the two different words, right? One is warned not to despise. The other is warned not to judge. And those two things are not the same. To despise means to treat with disdain, scorn, or contempt. In other words, I recognize liberty in this matter, and you're just dumb because you're just ignorant. You can't see this. Anybody that can see through the ladder can see that this thing is okay. That attitude of superiority because of knowledge. If you'll remember in another place, Paul said, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. So he warns about those who have knowledge and don't use it in love. And so we don't look down on others as being intellectually inferior, benighted. Fellowship might not be broken, but it might not be pursued. In other words, I'm not going to say you're wrong, but I'm going to keep my distance from you. And it might just be I'm going to keep my distance from you because I want to do what I want to do, and I don't want to fuss with you about it, which is not the right attitude. All right? Then you have do not judge one another. Means to pass judgment negatively or condemn another. By the way, that word is used again in verse 22. It says, and the danger here is the idea of the weaker, that the stronger is a sinner. And perhaps not even a true Christian. And in this case, fellowship might be severed. So you see how the stronger brother despises or can be tempted to despise or treat with contempt one he thinks is not as sharp as he is. Whereas the weaker brother says, man, I can't believe that such and so is doing this. What kind of person that calls themselves a Christian would do this? And in our context, what kind of person who calls themselves a Christian would eat meat offered to idols? That person must not even be a real Christian. And so now we've got the weaker brother judging the stronger brother as if he's not even deserving of fellowship because he might not even be a Christian. Because Christians don't do that. And so the Bible warns each side, but uses different types of warnings, different words to help us. And then I love the phrase, "For God has received him." God has received him. I think received him works on both sides. I don't think God has received him applies just to the judgment of the weaker against the stronger. He's talking about God. In other words, don't despise him who is weak because God has received him. Don't judge him, whom you think to be in the wrong because God has received him. That phrase applies to both sides. And what it boils down to is we got to remember, hey, we're all Christians here. We're all Christians. We're all trying to serve the Lord here. And there are matters wherein we are not always going to agree. But in matters where we don't agree, love has to prevail in those things. And so, I mentioned this earlier, but just into the second line in that last note paragraph. By way of reminder, the definition for this verb receive is to take to or with oneself in one's company, admit to one's society and fellowship. God has taken both unto himself, accepted both into his personal fellowship. So we dare not treat with contempt or sever from ourselves one whom God has recognized. So I like the idea. And again, let's look at that phrase receive in this context. Remember a minute ago I said, well, we might not pursue fellowship and keep somebody at arm's length because we want to do what we want to do. But that's not receiving him, is it? That's just tolerating him and keeping him at arm's length. But Paul says receive him. Receive him. Because God has received him. Again, we're all Christians here. Bottom of the page. Who are you to judge another's servant? For to his own master he what? Stands or falls. To his own master he stands or falls. Look top of the page here. Again, the word judge is the same in verse 3. And some think the text is given specifically to the weaker judging the stronger, but because the same word is also used in regard to both in verse 13, I'm going ahead in the text just showing you that the word is used more broadly later in this same chapter. It is best to apply the word to both. Don't judge the strong, don't judge the weak, don't judge. Who are you to judge another servant? In other words, who does the Christian serve? Serve the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's what the Bible teaches over and over again. We're servants of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, in matters of judgment, who do I answer to? I answer to the Lord Jesus Christ. I don't answer to somebody else. In what I believe or practice in these matters. All right. So now to verse 5. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. So now we have a new issue wherein brethren are not to judge. The first one was the matter of eating meat or not eating meat. There's no reference really to idols here in the first part. Because it says one eats only meat, one eats only vegetables, or one eats meat and one eats only vegetables. It's assumed that the meat has some idolatrous connection to it. But it could be some type of kosher issue. All right? But now Paul introduces a second matter of conscience, wherein brethren must not critique or judge one another, namely the observance of special days. The consideration of one day over another falls within the same category as personal discretion concerning food. Note how Paul enjoins the two verses together in verse 6. Now, verse 5 talks about one esteems one day above another, the other esteems every day alike. Then in verse 6, it pulls all those things together and says, one eats meat, one eats and he eats to the Lord. The other does not eat and he does not eat to the Lord. One esteems a day and he esteems it to the Lord, and the other does not esteem a day and he does not esteem it to the Lord. See how Paul's brought all four of these things together, saying that each person involved in any one of these four situations is serving the Lord by what he does, which makes them all equals. Makes them all equals. All right, then look at second paragraph. This has numerous applications. For example, we know from verse 20, Acts 21, how that many, the word there is literally myriads, of believing Jews were still zealous of the law. James took Paul aside and says, brother, you see how there are many Jews who believe. I mean, they're Christians, they've been baptized. And they are all zealous of the law. Notice, they're Christians, but they're still observant. They're still observing the various customs and restrictions associated with Judaism. Now, they're free to do that, so long as they don't judge their other brethren in that matter. But James said, but James is like, they're doing it, and they think you need to do it. And so, just to make sure that you don't offend them, you act like you still keep the law. And Paul did that. And I think he sinned when he did it, because all of Paul's trouble started right then and right there. All the troubles that befell Paul through the rest of the book of Acts started right there in that particular case. All right. Now, again, I'm not talking about what the Jews did to him when they dragged him out of Lystra and stoned him and all those things. I'm just talking about the rest of the book of Acts is predicated on this, what happens right here. All right. And so Paul recognized and James recognized here's a lot of Jews still walking according to the customs. So it's inconceivable that the observance of Jewish holy days had completely dissipated, including Sabbath observances. In Colossians 2 and verse 16, Paul says, let no man judge you in meat or drink or in the observance of the Sabbath or Sabbaths, special days. All right? And so, if Paul's writing about a man who observes a day and another man who does not observe a day, he may well be talking about Jews observing the Sabbath, or Jews still observing various feast days. All right? But some Jews, might have been like Peter and had knowledge, and they might not have been observing those days in the way that they used to. But Paul says whatever any man decides to do in this, let him be fully convinced in his own mind that this is what he needs to do. Which is ultimately where the chapter ends, is whatever's not of faith is sin. Whatever you're not fully convinced to do by your conscience or not do by your conscience, if you violate your conscience in that thing, you sin. So let every man be fully convinced in his own mind. And then third paragraph, the observance of days could extend to our own holidays that have either religious or pagan origins. The former, those with religious origins, might be Easter or Christmas. Those with pagan origins might be Halloween. And it could include the celebration of birthdays. It's in your handout, but who doesn't celebrate birthdays? Jehovah's Witnesses don't. And I lived next door to one for 2 years in Arizona. Perfectly lovely family, but they didn't observe birthdays. And I think I might have found out they were Jehovah's Witnesses when I think we maybe had invited them to Shelby's birthday. When she turned 2. They lived, their house was closer to our, it was one of them where our house was closer to one another than I was to John right now. All right? And so, but let me ask you a question. And their reasoning is, the only time you see anybody celebrating a birthday in the Bible is when Herod celebrated his birthday and John the Baptist ended up dead. That's their reasoning. Sir? You like that? So you're gonna and by the way, Scott, you're perfectly at liberty to observe no more birthdays. But I would suggest that you confine it to your own birthday and not the birthday of somebody sitting very close to you. That's a birthday that you better celebrate. All right? Just word of advice, brother. Now, am I at liberty not to celebrate my birthday? Am I at liberty to not celebrate my birthday on the same grounds as the Jehovah's Witnesses? Sure I am. Whatever reason I determine not to observe a birthday is just, it's valid. It sounds crazy because nobody wants to be associated with the Jehovah's Witnesses. All right? And I get that. But my point is, if I decided it was wrong for me to celebrate what if I was a Jehovah's Witness convert? All right? And I knew some Jehovah's Witness converts when I was in Tennessee. So I'm a Jehovah's Witness convert, and I'm not going to celebrate my birthday because I'm not fully convinced that I can do that, because I know what happened to John the Baptist when somebody in the Bible celebrated their birthday. All right?
That's crazy.
But I'm free to do it, right?
Yeah,
and you can't tell me I'm crazy.
But what
because it's been programmed in your mind since you were...
Are they ascribing that to some type of faith or worship toward God when they do that?
They're saying that we don't celebrate birthdays because the example that we have of people celebrating birthdays in the Bible ended up with John the Baptist with his head cut off. I don't agree with the John, I know. I don't agree with the logic. My question is, am I at liberty to use that logic for myself not to observe a birthday? All right. Now, I can't... Now,
there's a fine line, too, though, when you start ascribing it to saying it's biblical, not...
That's where I'm going.
I think
yeah. And here's my next question. Am I at liberty to tell you not to observe yours? I'm not. All right. But you're not at liberty to tell me I'm dumb for not observing mine. Yeah, and you're right. Most birthday parties among Christians don't end up with a bunch of drunk men and naked girls dancing. Now, John's last birthday accepted.
You're going to have that on me, John. Let us tell you.
All right. So, but you see my point, right? The observance of days, or the non-observance of days, is a matter of conscience. Even if you use bad logic to get there, it's a matter of conscience. And you have to, and by the way, if you know that I don't observe my birthday, this is going to get you. If y'all gather up at church on my birthday's on Sunday, and y'all gather up and sing happy birthday to me, it'd be a sin. It'd be a sin. It'd be a sin if you knew that I didn't celebrate my birthday and y'all gathered up and sang happy birthday to me. It'd be a sin because you're not respecting my conscience. Don't shoot me. That's a fact. That's a cold heart. Hey, it ain't no different. It ain't no different than if I knew you were observing Jewish food laws, which I know some Christians who still today observe Jewish food laws. Don't eat pork. It would be no different than if I invited you to my house and served you ribs and bacon and catfish, knowing what your conscience is. And I went ahead and did that. It'd be a sin for me to do that because I'm not respecting your conscience.
There's some members of the Church of Christ, like when we went to CYC, some women, they still wear head coverings.
Still wear the head coverings. They sure do.
And we wouldn't be wrong to not, but
You're not.
we told them they couldn't come in if they didn't take their.
That's right. If you give them grief over it, you're wrong. You sin when you don't respect their conscience in that matter. So, and that's what I'm trying to get at for this whole chapter, is that we have to get it in our mind about matters of scruple and conscience and matters of doctrine, and respect and love one another enough to respect one another's conscience in those matters. All right. By the way, I got so far out I forgot to say, while I do not know any Christian personally opposed to birthday celebrations, although I do know many women who refuse to count, if one were similarly convinced not to celebrate birthdays, I'm required to celebrate or respect their conscience. I do know some Christians who oppose the observance of Halloween, despite the fact that Halloween, by and large, has zero connection to the occult. Nobody in Marion County, Alabama, has any connections to the occult. When we celebrate Halloween, 500 years ago, it might have been a different story, right? That could have been a thing 500 years ago, but now the attachment to that thing has dissipated. But for some people, just the very thought that it has some attachment to the occult drives them to say, no, you can't, or they say, I can't do this. And sometimes they tell other Christians they ought not do that, and they don't have the liberty to do that. Listen, I dealt with a guy one time in Denver, Colorado, a member of the church now, former Catholic. And it's almost like he did a deep dive into every single Catholic tradition. Every single one of them. Even things I had never, ever heard of. I'm going to drop one on you, okay? We had a lengthy email exchange because he thought it was wrong for churches to put poinsettias on display in the church building at Christmas. Because he'd found some obscure reference to Catholicism being practiced in Mexico that involved poinsettias. I mean, what? But that's probably because of its attachment to Christmas and not an attachment to some type of religious, strange religious, attachment. And so, but again, my point is, some people just go crazy about what they think everything means. And here's one guy, and he's trying to bind this thing on a church of over 400 people. Basically giving the elders grief. Elders of a congregation, just because the elders don't have anything else to do other than worry about some obscure Mexican Catholic cult tradition. And so but again. If the predominant view is that a thing is attached to something that is sinful, we need to avoid it. I'll give you one more example, and I know I'm not even. Let me make a note here to pick back up here next week. Now it just came out of now it just left my head. I was worried about finding my place next week, and my example went out of my head. I don't even remember what I was thinking about now.
It don't get any better.
Hey, I know. So I'll just have to stop that right there. And man, I wish I could think of what I had for you. It was a really good example, but it's gone. I mean, it's gone. It ain't on the tip of my tongue gone. It's Elvis has left the building gone.
Mike used to say, oh, it might start like running.
It might, and I'll send y'all a light post tonight about 1 a.m. when I think about it. All right. If I think of it, I'll tell you, but I'm going to cut this thing off right now. Mercy.